everybody. So good to see you. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really excited to get to dig in a little bit deeper. When I was here back in February, we were trying to go through everything you need to know about fourth and fifth grade evidence-based reading practices and the entire practice guide. And it turned out that was not enough time to do that in 1 hour. So what we're going to do today, what I've heard from you, is a lot of you reached out to me and asked for more detail about the decoding threshold. That recommendation 1, where we're really digging into multisyllabic decoding and the research around the decoding threshold was an area of interest, and everybody wanted to hear more about that. So the good news is I've been doing more research about the decoding threshold, and also I got to meet with the researchers who published the original study and talk to them and have brunch with them just on Sunday. So I have lots more information to share with you about that. And then we're going to actually delve into the comprehension recommendations that we didn't get to last time. And then if we have time, and we may or may not because I overplanned as usual, I want to talk a little bit about how you can pull these recommendations together and support teachers in adding in evidence-based practices in their fourth and fifth grade classrooms. So hold on, I am going to clear my throat. I don't want to do that into the mic. But so I'm really excited to talk to you. So just to review, sort of pick up where we were last time, we're pulling from a number of resources that can support you in supporting your teachers with evidence-based practices for older learners. That includes the practice guide that Michelle was just discussing, that Sharon Vaughn is the main author of. So we're all on the same page about that being a terrific resource, and that is linked in the agenda if you want to pull that up while we're talking. Obviously, the instructional practices guide, the literacy essentials for 4 and 5 align. It's just that the IES practice guide goes into more detail. And then there's also, I'm going to be pulling some things from this fantastic book by Sharon Walpole, who I know is well known to the network also, about differentiated literacy instruction in grades 4 and 5. We also talked a little bit about these thinking traps. These were some of the thinking traps we discussed around 4 and 5. That teachers often have, where they feel like they can't or don't know how to support kids who still have instructional needs for their reading in grades 4 or 5 and up. So what we were discussing last time is we want to support our educators on understanding the full continuum of reading development, not just how to get kids over that initial hump in kindergarten and first grade, but how reading develops over time and what kids can do at each stage. Oftentimes we're frustrated with kids who don't seem to have learned what we thought they should have learned in the previous stage, but we want to foster an educator mindset that focuses on what they are learning and can do. We want to make sure teachers can use developmentally appropriate evidence-based practices, and we want them to be, as a result of both learning and doing those things, teachers with strong self-efficacy across the grade band and those with high expectations for their students at all stages. Here are the 4 recommendations from the practice guide that we were discussing. We got deeply into 1 and 2 and 4. We started with 4 because, in my opinion, the texts that kids are reading in these grade levels are paramount. And getting them to have exposure in those difficult texts is critically important. And then we went back to 1 and 2, and then we didn't make it to 3. I got a lot of questions about 1. Recommendation 1, so we're going to dive into that more deeply first, and then we're going to skip down to recommendation 3, and then we're going to talk about putting it all together. As I mentioned, we discussed the decoding threshold last time, and this is what I presented last time. This was a study by Wang and colleagues at Educational Testing Service that looked at word reading and comprehension data for hundreds of thousands of kids nationwide from grades 4 and up. And what they found was that in their word recognition and decoding task, there was what they called a decoding threshold. And that means that if kids had achieved a certain level of decoding skill by the end of 5th grade, they continued to grow in their comprehension skills throughout middle school and high school and benefit from comprehension instruction. If they did not meet that threshold, then they did not demonstrate comprehension growth after 5th grade. And there are lots of different possible reasons for that, including a mismatch between the instruction that they would get in middle school and high school and the skills that they need. But basically, this is what we think of as a prerequisite for comprehension growth. And they estimated that about 38% of 5th grade students do not meet that threshold nationwide in that original paper. as I said, I was at the American Educational Research Association conference last weekend, and I actually set up a symposium so I could present with the guys who did this original study and learn more about this test, more about the data, and more about their research on this topic, because I'm getting so many questions. It was almost like, it was something when I presented this in February, I got a bunch of emails and a bunch of questions about what this is. Where is it? How do we know if kids have it? And so I've been trying to delve a little bit more deeply into that topic, and I'm excited to share what I found with you today. Basically, the ETS researchers have now replicated that original study where they took a second large cohort and demonstrated the existence of that same decoding threshold on their task. And they also dug a little bit more deeply into what the kids who are below the decoding threshold are doing when they're taking their word recognition assessment. So I want to show you what that looks like. Their estimate now is more around 25% of kids nationwide, which is a little bit better, are below that decoding threshold. But it varies quite considerably from school to school and context to context. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what this test actually is, because I think when we hear the word decoding, what are we picturing? CVC words, right? We're picturing kids in kindergarten and first grade decoding CVC words and just sounding them out. And we're picturing them sounding out words that are pretty familiar, right? Like dog, cat, that kind of thing. Okay, here's what the actual task involves. It involves looking at a word on the screen. It's a computer-based assessment, and deciding if it is a real word, a nonsense word, or a pseudo-homophone. Now, they don't use that word with the kids. They use sound, yeah. But it means it sounds like a real word. So there's 3 different types of items. Which ones do you think are the hardest for the kids which ones do you think are the hardest for the kids below that decoding threshold? What was that? Nonsense words? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And pseudo-homophones. Yes, you are correct. So here's what it looks like. They show a word, and you have to say, is this a real word, not a real word, or sounds exactly like a real word? So you can't just look at it and say, I know it or I don't know it, real word or not real. You have to stop and process it phonologically, and then decide if it sounds like a real word. So let's pretend we're kids. Is this a real word, not a real word, sounds like a real word? All right. Yep. Mm-hmm. All right, so which ones of these questions would be the hardest for kids below the decoding threshold? Blue, absolutely. So what they've found is that these items are the hardest for kids below the decoding threshold because they don't attempt them. They look at a word, they don't recognize it, and they do not engage in the phonological process to figure out if it sounds like a real word or not. They just say not a real word, and they move on to the next one. So they spend much less time attempting to read unfamiliar words than kids above the decoding threshold. So I thought that was interesting. I want to point out that this concern about kids in the upper elementary grade goes all the way back to Jean Shaw, who was who invented the stages of reading development. And she really argued that there's this learning to read phase in grades K, 1, and 2. And then kids are shifting into reading to learn. And we've kind of given up on those 2 categories because we think kids should learn to read and read to learn the entire time in both that they're in school. But there was this documented phenomenon of the 4th grade slump that she noticed and other researchers noticed years ago. And it has to do with the increasing text volume that kids have to tackle at this stage. That reading challenge increases as kids get into 3rd and 4th grade, right? They've been reading words, lots of books that have those CVC or CVCE, silent E word patterns, lots of single syllable words. And then they are developing, and then they have to engage with texts that have longer and more difficult words, particularly in their informational text reading. And that was one of the things that Jean Shaw believed was the cause of the 4th grade slump, was the increasing demands of informational text reading that include words like disorganization, equilibrium, and naturalization. So what I was trying to do with my little study that I'm going to present now is dig into some of the data that I've been collecting for my Read Stop Write project, which is a shared project with researchers at the University of Buffalo, and we've been collecting data for 3 years now, both in Buffalo and in schools in Michigan, including in Carman-Ainsworth, one of my favorite research partner districts, to figure out where this decoding threshold really is, right? The example items that I showed you are all single syllable, but that's not how the test works. If you get those items correct, it keeps getting harder and harder and harder. So I was like, where is this decoding threshold happening? Is it this step up from single syllable to two syllable words that is causing children problem? Or is it a little bit higher? Is it that they can read two syllable words, but they're having trouble getting to those more difficult informational text type of words? And so I wanted to take a look at our data so far and really dig into one context that's been part of my research study and figure out how many kids are below the decoding threshold and what instructional needs they might have. So as I mentioned, this is part of the Read Stop Write project. And for this study, we were looking at the participants in one large urban charter school in Buffalo, New York. And we were able to, it was a fairly diverse school, fairly low socioeconomic context. We had a whole bunch of measures. I just want to walk you through what they are so that you can understand what they actually tell us about what kids can do for their reading. One is the multisyllabic decoding inventory. This is Sharon Walpole's measure from her book. It measures 140 two-syllable words. This takes a very long time to administer. I don't really recommend it. And it includes both real and nonsense two-syllable words that follow 7 different syllable patterns. So here are some examples. This is untimed. You just have to keep going. It's very long. But we also looked at the tower. I don't know if any of you have ever administered the tower, but this is a timed test of word recognition. So you see how many sight words that kids can read in 45 seconds and how many nonsense words. It starts with 2-letter words and it keeps getting longer and longer. So the more words they can get through in 45 seconds, the higher their score. And we also did Dibble's oral reading fluency, which I'm sure is very familiar to you, where we listen to the children read for 1 minute, see how many words they can read accurately in that time. We also gave something called the TOSREC. Sorry, this is blurry. But the TOSREC is called the test of silent reading efficiency and comprehension. And it's basically this. It's a bunch of sentences. They have to read them silently and say if they are true or false. So a cow is an animal. True. A fish lives on land. False. Yeah, and so there's a test page of like 60 items. They keep going for 3 minutes and answer as many of them as they can, and they get harder than this as they go. They have harder words, and then we also gave something called the motivation to read profile for nonfiction. So we tried to figure out what the role motivation is playing in students' experiences at this stage. Here are descriptive statistics for all of these measures. It's a lot. I just want to point out that the mean score on the decoding threshold test, which is the Read Basics WRD, word recognition decoding task, is actually below the decoding threshold. So this is a low-performing population in this particular school. But if you look at their MDI real words, so that's the assessment of how many two-syllable words they can read, they are reading 60 out of 70 of those real words correctly. So that's very high. That's 86% of the items. And you look at the non-words that are two-syllable, those are also 46%. So that's the untimed test. So they can read two-syllable words pretty well if they have unlimited time. But if you look at the time tasks, the scores are much lower. Where they're the 10th percentile or the 15th or 25th percentile nationwide on the timed tasks of reading. Even though this was a combined 4th and 5th grade sample, the kids are reading below the 4th grade benchmark for fluency on average. So it's a fairly low performing population overall. In fact, and when we dug into it, we saw that exactly half of them were below the decoding threshold and half were above, although there were differences by grade level. More kids in 5th grade were above the decoding threshold. And if you look at the demographics of the kids who are below that threshold, they're very similar to the school demographics as a whole. And I particularly want to emphasize that they are not more likely to be English language learners if they're below the decoding threshold. And this is not primarily special ed or dyslexic kids. These are kids who are having trouble with reading but can read a lot of words. So when we look at what they can do, they can read, there were significant, but when we dig down into what they can do, what we know is that there are differences in their ability to read all kinds of words for kids below and above the decoding threshold. There were significant differences across all types of two-syllable words, but they were fairly small. In general, kids above the decoding threshold could read 2 more words on any given subtest than kids below. There were bigger gaps on non-words, which is what you predicted. And when we look at individual items, they were significantly different about half of the word level items. So that top line, the green line are kids above the decoding threshold, and the blue line are kids below the decoding threshold. And you'll notice these items are ranked by difficulty. So the easiest item was Batman, and the hardest item was Bugle. And so you'll notice that they have very similar word reading abilities, whether they're above or below the decoding threshold. For the easier items, compound words with closed first syllables, those are generally pretty easy. But then they spread apart and have a bigger gap when we're talking about words that have open first syllables, like diner or rely or spiny. Words that have morphological components and spelling changes like spiny, and words with silent E on the end. I was very curious about that. Why is that silent E pattern that's usually easy for kids, and kids can usually learn in first grade, why is it hard when we add it onto a 2-syllable word? And then you'll notice the differences collapse again when we get to the hardest items, because just not many kids knew this. When we look at the tower, the speeded differences were bigger than the non-speeded differences. So the ability to recognize words quickly and to decode words phonemically showed up as a difficulty here too. So we're talking about 11 words different. They can read 11 more words. Kids above the decoding threshold read about 11 more words in 45 seconds. And we look at the Dibbles Orff, then we find a really big difference, okay? The kids below the decoding threshold are reading under 100 words correct per minute, which is really slow. It's very painfully slow. Whereas kids above the decoding threshold are reading 140 words per minute. So every minute that they're reading 40 fewer words. That accumulates over time. That's a really qualitatively different experience that they're having. They're also reading much less accurately, and the whole usually around 94% accuracy compared to 98% for kids above the decoding threshold. So, and if you look at the TOSREC, their difference is here in how many sentences they can comprehend. In every 3 minutes of reading, they are taking in and understanding 5 fewer sentences. So if you think about those experiences over time, this last one's going to make sense to you, which is that there's a very significant difference, a large gap in students' reading self-concept between kids below and above the decoding threshold, but not value. So kids still see the value in reading nonfiction. They know they want to do it, but they don't believe they can do it. And that's like the really saddest part for me. That was really important. So what we know is that kids who are below the decoding threshold, they can read a lot of words. They don't need to go back to first grade phonics. They can read a lot of 2-syllable words. But in general, they're going to recognize fewer words. They're going to have a lower sight word vocabulary, fewer 2-syllable words, and they're going to have a really difficult time with non-words. Now, I don't think we should teach non-words. I don't think that's the recommendation I would take away from this. But what we are seeing consistently is that these kids below the decoding threshold do not attempt words that they don't recognize. And non-words are proxy for that, right? We know they're reading way, way, way less fluently, and that's impacting their comprehension and their ability, and their self-concept, and their just ability to get through more text. And we also know that that's messing with their motivation to keep reading. So when we're talking about where the decoding threshold is, it's actually fairly high up. Right? Kids can read most of familiar 2-syllable words, and it's more complex 2-syllable words that they're having difficulties with. What I'm seeing, because I did administer this test, these tests myself, as well as my entire research team, including my co-PIs, Dr. Strong and Anderson at Buffalo, as well as our wonderful doc students, is that what kids do is they look at the first syllable of a 2-syllable word, and then they just kind of go from there. Right? So spinny, cascade, diner, or dinner, lattice, right? They just look at the first syllable and sort of go from there. So a lot of kids would say dinner instead of diner. A lot of kids would say lotus instead of lotus. A lot of kids would say cascade or cascade or cascade or, and they just kind of let the second syllable go. And they don't have confidence in their ability to take on each syllable. They also aren't paying attention to the morphological parts that make up a word, right? Another thing, and they can confuse words like bubble and bugle, right? Because they aren't as sure how to spell dinner, so sure that they know how to spell dinner that they recognize that this is diner instead. So these are not beginning readers, but these are kids who need help paying attention to every part of a multisyllabic word. My professional advice to teachers, especially in 4th and 5th grade, is not to go get the expensive CAPT test, but really just pay attention to your kids and see if they're having difficulty attempting unfamiliar words. What do they do when they come to a word they don't know? Do they look at the first syllable and guess? Or are they able to really engage with that word and try to figure it out and decode it and vowel flex and try to make sure that it matches up to a real word? Are they reading below 100 words correct per minute? If so, those are likely to be kids who have some significant word reading needs. And if you are giving some sort of national standardized test, you could look at kids who are in the bottom 15th to 20th percentile if you're giving some sort of standardized timed word recognition test. What these kids need, in my opinion, is instruction in useful word parts, especially morphemes, routine and practice and encouragement to tack and figure out new words, support for learning the meaning of new words and developing content area vocabulary, because that helps them figure out if they've gotten the word right rather than just giving up and moving on, and lots of opportunities to read with support, especially that fluency support that we talked about last time. Instruction in common prefixes, which is one of the recommendations in the practice guide, is going to be key for this for these students, as well as suffixes, recognizing that ER is a suffix. And that means there's sometimes a spelling change, recognizing that Y at the end is a suffix, and sometimes that means there's a spelling change. When common Greek and Latin roots can also be very helpful for breaking words apart and trying to make sure that we understand what they mean. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And we had this word part lesson sequence that's embedded in the slide that's recommended based on the practice guide as well for teaching word parts that might help kids figure out these difficult words. We also talked a little bit about routines for trying to break apart words. There's a lot of these. Teaching a routine is the recommendation. It doesn't have to be exactly one of these, but there's the best strategy where kids break the word apart, examine the base word, say each part, and then try the whole word. Or the Ishlav strategy, which is a little bit longer, but involves paying attention to vowel teams and identifying known word parts. But basically, what we want to do is give kids tools to attack those difficult words that they encounter in text, because what we're finding is that the kids who are not making progress, it's because they're not taking the time to do that and they don't feel like they have the tools to do it. So what we want to make sure we do is get kids beyond this, right? This is what's in my opinion, looking at the evidence and talking to the researchers, my opinion is what's happening with these kids is every time they sit down to read, they're having difficulties. There's just too many words that are unfamiliar to them. And as they go, they are recognizing fewer words automatically, and they're failing to figure out the new words that they're encountering in those texts. As a result, every time they read, it's a lower quality experience. They're slow, they have less vocabulary learning, they don't understand it as well. As a result, reading is not fun, they have lower reading motivation, and they read less and get less experience reading, which means they have fewer opportunities to improve all the things that would make reading more fun and more engaging and more beneficial. And as a result, they have less comprehension growth over time. So what we're trying to do is intervene in the first box to prevent that experience from becoming a permanent feature of their education. So there are a couple of different questions, and there are also, you reminded me of some links that I will put in the agenda. There are, if you feel like you do not have, there's one website that has information about that provides some free resources around informational multisyllabic decoding. Jessica Tost at UT Austin has produced some really great material, so I'll be linking her website in the agenda so you can look at things, because one of the things that came up in our discussion is that a lot of curricula don't handle multisyllabic decoding very well or have very much emphasis on it. And I'll talk a little bit about how I address that in my research project later. But another question that came up is, what about kids who are not just below the decoding threshold, but really far below the decoding threshold, like the kids who actually still do need support with single syllable decoding in fourth and fifth grade. Those kids absolutely exist. What I'm trying to do with this work is show that that's not most of them. Most of the kids who have word recognition needs in fourth and fifth grade have word recognition needs in multisyllabic decoding. But there are about 5% of kids who still have, instructional needs that are focused on single syllable decoding. Absolutely, they need that instruction. They should not get that instruction. Some of the interventions that you would use with younger kids are appropriate. You want to make sure that they're not like too cutesy, right? That they really focus on the word reading, and that they don't replace opportunities to do higher level work with content area texts, because the kids who are below who are very, very far below their word recognition still need to be developing their world knowledge, their vocabulary. They still need social studies and science content. And so I would make sure that intervention time is not replacing their opportunities to get exposed to grade level texts and ideas. I know that's hard because sometimes they need to be pulled when they need to be pulled, but absolutely they can still benefit from more traditional decoding interventions. But I would want that to be in addition to, not in place of, scaffolding them and to experience the grade level curriculum however they can. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're trying to scaffold more kids into experiencing grade level text. But those kids definitely need that support. Usually with older kids, it's not the first time they've seen this content, however, so oftentimes that intervention work can go faster than it would for a younger kid. So that's something to consider too. You want to make sure you're moving at an appropriate pace and that you're moving them out of intervention when they actually have mastered the content. They probably don't need to go through the lessons in exactly the same order at exactly the same pace that a younger child would. So then finally, Annie brought up a wonderful point, which is that when you are assessing kids, it's really helpful to note which words they're having trouble with and what they say instead, right? Like I was mentioning dinner and diner and cascade and cascade and that kind of thing. That is not a formal part of the multisyllabic decoding inventory, which is in Sharon's book, but in fact, she says not to do that because it takes too much time when you're scoring. But it is incredibly helpful if you are able to make that sort of notation. And a tool developed by our fabulous Nell Duke, the listening while reading, watching while writing protocol does encourage you to write down specifically the words that kids have trouble with. And so I'll link that in the agenda also. That's a fabulous tool for noticing what kinds of mistakes kids are making with these multisyllabic words, because that can tell you a lot about what they need. What we want we want our educators to understand how word knowledge develops over time and what kind of evidence-based strategies they can use to teach multisyllabic words. We do not want them to panic when they have kids below the decoding threshold. We don't want them to make any assumptions about what's going to happen to these kids or what they can and can't do. We want them to assess and address these kids' specific needs and focus on building reading fluency as well. So the multisyllabic decoding and fluency needs go hand in hand, is what the data is showing us. And we want teachers who are confident that who can be teachers that they can prepare students for middle and high school and the rest of their academic careers. So that's a deeper dive into recommendation one. We only have about 8 minutes until our break. So I wanted to get us started, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and do more. But as I said, we didn't have a chance to really dig deeply into recommendation 3 last time. What I find in my work with teachers, and you may disagree, is that the comprehension work is a lighter lift for them. Many of these strategies that are evidence-based are familiar to them. They feel comfortable teaching comprehension to older children, and it's really just about reminding them that these strategies exist and that they can use them. So sometimes this is a little bit easier than the multisyllabic decoding piece for my 4th and 5th grade teachers that I work with. But I want to start by diving into these practices aligned with recommendation 3. There are 4 different parts. And I want to start with the first one: build students' world and word knowledge so that they can make sense of text. And because this aligns really well with what we're already talking about with multisyllabic decoding. So in this recommendation, they combine world and word knowledge. And there's a reason for that, excuse me, which is that when you're trying to engage in a discussion or reading about a high-level topic, the content area vocabulary is a major hindrance or help to being able to do that. So if you're talking about an ecosystem, understanding what ecosystem is going to be really important. If you're talking about habitats, what it means to inhabit a place, what inhabitants are, when you're talking about all the vocabulary is going to help you understand what you're talking about. So you want to make sure you're developing world knowledge that includes the content area vocabulary that will support reading comprehension going forward. So the recommendations for the practice guide include providing a brief 3 to 5 minute introduction on a topic before reading. This is something I do in my intervention project as well, and it can easily get out of hand. You could easily spend 15 minutes doing this, but that eats into their reading time, right? So keeping this brief, but providing background reading passages that are easier before reading a higher level text on the same topic. So giving kids opportunities to sort of warm up. Presenting a 2 to 4 minute video clip, podcast, or lecture, and asking students questions about the topic before reading. This last one is really interesting because it can help you assess a little bit where they're at with that particular knowledge. I may have mentioned this before, but in my project, we were doing this with a text about the Revolutionary War, and we just sort of asked them what they know about the Revolutionary War, and we got a couple questions in before it was clear that they were thinking about the Civil War. And so getting them into thinking, they're like, the North and the South, and we were like, okay, wrong war. So really helping clarify and establish that can help them dive into a text with strong comprehension and background knowledge activated. We want to think about what the reader already knows about the topic and how that overlaps with what the author of the text is assuming the reader knows. If there are gaps between what you think your students know and what the author is assuming, those brief introductory things are a great place to address that. We often talk about activating prior knowledge by brief discussions and trying to tap into their science and social studies instruction, but sometimes you're trying to teach something that they actually don't know anything about. And then you have to go to the build prior knowledge. And there's some really oldies but goodies. The KWL chart, how many of you have seen this before? This is very evidence-based. I actually was on a paper where we looked at this and compared it to other types of reading comprehension strategies, and this one was better. So this actually helps a lot, having kids think about what they know, what they want to know, and what they're learning from reading a text. In particular, getting specific about the kinds of categories of things they think they're going to learn. This is something they can do in the older grades that younger kids can't do. So this is I've seen teachers recently in my other project that focuses on digital text reading create these charts for informational text reading that kids are doing on their tablets so that they have something real and physical to work with even when they're doing research on the computer. And that's been really helpful to sort of connect and make that experience more deep and engaging. But we want to make sure that we get kids to zero in on a topic, read a lot about that topic, and then that will enhance their background knowledge for the next time they need to learn or talk about that topic. But there's another more supportive way of doing this if the KWL is too light touch, if you feel like they really don't know very much about the topic, which is to provide a preview of the text before getting started, including difficult words and concepts. There's like a little listening component where they are getting all the information they're going to read about. Then they go read about it, and then you discuss it afterwards. This is also an evidence-based practice. It's pretty, in the study that I was talking about earlier, we compared this to KWL, and KWL was slightly better because we spent too much time discussing and not enough time reading. Kids would never there was too much listening at the beginning. Kids almost barely finish the text and never got a chance to discuss it. So if you do all three steps, it's very evidence-based and can really support kids who have lower background knowledge on a particular topic. But it's very easy for the first component of this to get out of control and then to reduce the comprehension focus. I only have a couple more minutes, but this is the vocabulary section. Basically making sure that kids are understanding the words that are critical to the meaning of the text. identifying those. You can teach them before reading. I know there's a lot of debate in science whether or not we're supposed to pre-teach vocabulary, but you can teach a couple of words before reading if you think that's going to help them. Make sure you're supporting with definitions, examples, non-examples, and or visual representations. That visual representation is especially supportive for multilingual learners. And you can also stop during reading. It's not all or nothing, right? If you realize, come to a word you realize the kids don't know, you can stop and discuss it and help them there. This here is where prefixes and suffixes come up again, right? Because prefixes and suffixes are not just helpful for decoding a word, they're also helpful for understanding the meaning of those words. So morphology gets sort of like double billing in the practice guide. It's under the recommendation 1 and under recommendation 3. But context clues come in here as well. You want to make sure you model and teach kids how to look around a new word to figure out what it means, and find the context clues and try to make a hypothesis about what that word means. They're not always going to be able to drop the book and go find a dictionary, right? So we want to teach them to use context clues. And this is going, and what I have found in my research is that context clues are way better in some texts than others, right? Science texts in particular do a great job of just like defining the words. Social studies texts will just throw out all kinds of words and like assume you're going to stay with them. And so it's also important to teach kids that sometimes the context clues will have what you want and sometimes they won't. So you can put together word part clues and context clues to figure out what a new word in the text means. And you can also teach kids the different types of context clues they may encounter. Sometimes kids don't realize that when something is being described that's the opposite of the word, right? Or that they're being given an example of that type of word. I realized that I brushed over context clues and word part clues a little too quickly because there is some chatter, I guess, in the field about what we should do about context clues. Are these evidence-based? Does this disagree with what we're teaching as far as decoding? Is this not science of reading? It's in the practice guide. So it is science of reading. I just want to say that, but it's not. But when we're talking about context clues, we are not talking about using them to guess words in the text. We're not talking about using them to replace decoding the word. Kids still need to decode the word and recognize the word first. What we're talking about is using context clues to figure out the meaning of a new vocabulary word. And this is one of the major shifts for kids in 4th, 5th, 6th grade and up, is that they're suddenly learning new vocabulary words from texts. Most younger kids, when they're decoding a new word, it's a word that they've heard before, right? But they've just never seen it in text. Older kids are actually doing active vocabulary learning from their reading. In fact, if they're not big readers, they won't have a lot of vocabulary growth in middle school and high school. Most new vocabulary learning does come from texts. So that's when context clues are helpful. They don't replace decoding. They don't replace learning to read words part by part, but they can be used to figure out the meaning or enrich your understanding of the meaning of a new word when you encounter it in text. And many words have multiple meanings, right? So encountering the same word, even if you've seen it before or heard it before, encountering it in a new context, in a new text, enriches your understanding of the meaning. So you do want to attend to context clues, especially in informational text, for that purpose, for word meaning learning purposes, not decoding. But that's why this practice guide recommends putting this together with word part clues. We want to attend to word parts and decoding, and then we also want to attend to meaning at the same time. And I'll show an example, if I have time, I'll show an example of how I do this in my work later. But I just wanted to clarify, we're not talking about covering up the word or looking at the picture and guessing. We're talking about reading the word, realizing you want to learn more about that word, and paying attention to what the text is trying to teach you about that word. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. All right, so let's go into the next one. Consistently provide, second part of recommendation 3, consistently provide students with opportunities to ask and answer questions to better understand the text they read. This doesn't mean just, taking a quiz after a book is over, but there are several different ways, the oldies and goodies, the strategies that have supported kids in asking and answering questions. Asking and answering questions is a research-based comprehension strategy. We just want to make sure we're doing it in a way that's engaging to students. One of the oldies and goodies is the reciprocal teaching method. This is when students make a prediction, work with each other in small groups. They make predictions, they read about what's going to happen. They read part of the text, they ask questions, clarify, and summarize, and then switch to a different discussion leader. So this helps kids work in small groups and collaboratively, which is also something that's very good for multilingual learners, and helps them all take responsibility for their own reading comprehension and their group's reading comprehension. We also want to make sure that kids are answering different types of questions. Sometimes there's a lot of research on what are discussions of books that kids are reading, and many of the questions that tend to be asked and answered are right there questions, right? Like very literal. The book says this, and it's almost like quizzing, kind of going back and forth between the teacher and the student. That's going to be probably the least helpful. You might want to ask one or two of those right there questions at the beginning to sort of establish that everybody understands what happened. But then you want to move very quickly in either written questions or oral questions into think and search questions. This is when the answer is in the text, but it comes from multiple places in the text. So you have to kind of think about themes or things that are reoccurring through the text, right? I don't know if anybody watches The Pit, but you know how like there's just all these like little tiny hints that something's up with Dr. Langdon, and then all of a sudden it all comes together at the end, right? That's a think and search question, like what's going on with Dr. Langdon, right? You have to think about about all these tiny little things that have happened throughout the show to put it together. That's a think and search question, and those are really productive for comprehension. Author and me, that's an answer that's not in the text. That's about your personal interpretation of something that's happened in the text. So it's not a yes or no question. It's not obvious. You have to think about what's happening and kind of filter it through your own background knowledge and experiences and fit the text into your world knowledge. This is particularly helpful for informational texts, because what we're trying to do with informational texts is help kids think about what they already know and how the text fits into what they already know about that topic. So either expanding, adding more detail to the schema they have for that topic, or even realizing they had a misconception about that topic and addressing that when there's a conflict between what you thought you knew and what you're learning in the text. And then on my own questions, these are questions that are really great writing prompts, actually. This is great if you want kids to respond to the text in writing in a way that they are about something that they are thinking and connecting to their own ideas and experience. This is not that giving them the opportunity to do that in writing is definitely a comprehension, evidence-based practice for comprehension. Sometimes in an oral classroom discussion, it can derail the discussion, right? Then all of a sudden it's like, well, when I went to the zoo, this thing happened. When I went to so sometimes I teach my pre-service teachers to use these sparingly in discussion, but liberally in writing exercises. And so there are all types of different sentence frames that you can use to help deepen kids' thinking. Again, these are moving beyond just the literal right there questions. How are this and this the same? How are they different? How will you interpret this? What are the strengths and weaknesses? What could have prevented the problem from happening? And another thing to point out is that these can be used for informational or narrative texts. So questioning is something that I see in classrooms all the time, but thinking about the quality of the questions that we're asking and the way we're asking kids to respond is how we can enrich this recommendation. And then the next recommendation is teach students a routine for determining the gist of a short section of text. This is something I don't see that often in classrooms and is super, super helpful. So basically, this is a way of making them process what they've read and summarize. So when they've read something, thinking about the most important thing or person, place, or thing that has been addressed in a text or a section of text, and make a list of the important things that happened or that you learned, and synthesize it into one or two sentences in your own words. So these need to be complete sentences that summarize what you've just read. 3-step process: name the who or what, tell the most important thing or things about the who or what, and say it in 10 words or fewer. Sometimes I let them do 20, but basically the idea is that that's going to help them pay attention to what they're reading and understand what they're reading as they go. And then an additional recommendation around using the in the practice guide is to teach students how to use text structures. This is much more common for informational texts. There's more research around this for informational text because there are several different ways that informational text can be organized, as opposed to story grammar, which is pretty consistently used from story to story, but you can use text structures for either. And basically, we want to teach kids how to identify and discriminate against different types of text structures. So like now I'm reading a problem solution text. Now I'm reading a description text so that they can understand how that information is being presented to them and what to expect next. And then you want to help them answer questions about the text and use the text structure to identify the important information and generate just statements. Here are the common informational text structures. Compare, contrast, cause, effect, problem, solution, sequence, and description. Unfortunately, many informational texts sort of wander between these different text structures. If you're using authentic text, you'll start with one, and then there'll be a little timeline, and then there'll be a little other thing. So it's not as straightforward as just identifying one text structure, but being familiar with the ways that information can be organized will help students identify the key information and understand the text. And then you can use these to create just statements, to structure the kinds of questions that you want students to ask and answer. And then finally, the last part of recommendation 3 is to teach students to monitor their comprehension as they read. So making sure that they know that the point of reading is understanding, right? And going back and rereading if they don't understand. So you can help them check their understanding at the end. Writing a just statement is one way to do that, but you can also do this orally. What was the section about? What is happening? If I'm not sure, go back and figure out where the obstacle to comprehension is. Is it the words that I can't read or understand? Or is it a particular phrase or sentence that threw me off? Should I reread? I don't know if any of you have ever tried to teach Lord of the Rings to middle school students, but there's that passage at the beginning where it talks about how hobbits are really good at making everything except choose, but it's very convoluted syntax, and they always get it backwards and think that the hobbits are only good at making shoes. And I'm like, no, they don't wear shoes. Like, it's like, and it becomes very confusing. So like sometimes just going back and pinpointing that section or that part that threw them off can help them understand and set them up for understanding the whole rest of the text. Identifying specific words or phrases, going back and rereading sections, and then summarizing the main points of a particular section. You can organize these comprehension strategies in a before, during, and after framework. You can think about what to do before reading, which is build background knowledge, or activate or build that background knowledge, and then teach the technical vocabulary that kids will need to understand the text. And then during reading, you can use those comprehension strategies, model them, support kids in using them in small groups, make sure there's opportunities for collaboration and discussion among children. And then also you can support word reading and vocabulary learning during reading too. I know we like to pretend it's either or, but it's really both, right? When kids are having trouble with a word, that's part of comprehension monitoring. And then after reading, having a discussion of the text meaning that gets beyond the literal and beyond, ideally, where the children are responding to each other. I know Emmy Parks and I got to talk about that in the math and literacy context at our quarterly meeting, at our meeting last August. But those opportunities where kids are responding to each other are the most valuable for their learning, and teach them to ask and answer high quality questions about texts. So this overlaps really well with our essentials 2, 5, and 7, where we are talking about, I don't know why 2 isn't showing up, sorry, but a discussion of ideas in texts and how to construct text meaning across texts, and intentional and ambitious efforts to build vocabulary, academic language, and content knowledge. I appreciated my table talks with all of you again. And I wanted to, something that came up, and I think we're going to talk about this now too, but is that it's not that reciprocal teaching is the only routine that you can use to have productive small group discussions in your classroom, right? Or the only routine you can use to ask and answer questions. But just having some sort of routine that regularly engages kids in that work really helps make things easier on the teacher, right? Because they know how to do it. We're going to get in our reciprocal teaching groups and you're going to go, right? So building in those routines early in the school year allows kids to do a lot of intellectual work throughout the year that will really support their comprehension. And I wanted something else that came up is that none of this is new, right? Like KWLs, we've been around forever. Reciprocal teaching has been around forever. But so the point of the practice guide is not necessarily to say these are new things you're not doing, but rather to think about them a little bit differently. I think over the years they've been kind of thought of as the content of ELA instruction, right? Like, here's what I need to teach my students in ELA instruction. I need to teach them comprehension strategies. I need to teach them how to make predictions. I need to teach them, how to, answer inferential questions about text. But this is really beyond ELA instruction. What we're doing in 4th grade, 5th grade, secondary grades is teaching them to using these strategies to learn about the world. Right? This cuts across social studies, science, math, all the subject areas that they're going to be diving into in middle school. And so what we want them to do is to become really good readers so that they can read and learn across the subject areas. So really not thinking of it as just like, this is my area, my ELA instruction, but how can I use these things that we are learning in ELA to support reading high-level texts? Because that's where like the real learning and growth happens. And so that's why stretch text is one of those 4 recommendations, and one of the recommendation, and the recommendation we talked about first, because if kids are really, really good at predicting, but they never use that to read something that's a little bit hard for them, the growth won't happen, right? It's about using these strategies to support reading complex text. So I wanted to take a few minutes here at the end to try to show how my research project with Dr. Strong and Dr. Anderson has tried to put all of these recommendations together. Because what I find is when I go and work with teachers and I say, here are all the recommendations for the practice guide, they're like, like it feels like a long laundry list of things that they're supposed to do and a lot of prep that they're supposed to do. And that's a lot of work for them, right? And so what we tried to do is actually say, what would this look like if we could just put it all together and show teachers how to do it? And this, of course, connects across all the literacy essentials. So it's all stuff we're already doing and want to do. But what would happen is if we organized it around one text, right? If we ask kids to do this comprehension work and this multisyllabic work, decoding work and this fluency work and this vocabulary work, if we took everything that we want them to do and we organized it around the goal of reading one complex informational text per week. So that's what we did. We created an instructional routine that allows kids to do all of this work while engaging in one particular text a week. And so we have 4 days where they work with this text. They read it multiple times to build their fluency. On the first day, the goal of the reading is to think about what they're going to learn, and then then decode and figure out the key vocabulary words that they need to learn. So I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. On the second day, they read it again, focusing on identifying main ideas and details in the text and writing one of those just statements. On the third day, they read it again and think about the text structure and organize all their main ideas and details into a graphic organizer. On day 4, they they plan and write about the topic themselves. So you can see that all the comprehension strategies that we've discussed are built in there along with fluency and multisyllabic decoding support. And this is kind of and we've chosen texts that are difficult, that are on science and social studies topics and aligned with the standards. So we have 24 weeks of lessons for 4th and 5th grade that we've developed now. And so this is sort of, so the idea is to not just tell teachers to do things, but actually give them materials that help them do it. So here's an example from a 5th grade lesson. Here, what the kids strategy. Here's the kids strategy sheet. Again, you don't have to use one routine or strategy, but this is the routine we've developed. We teach it to the kids so they always know what to do when they encounter a new text. We have them read, and then STOP: summarize, text structure, organize, plan, and then write. That's why it's called read, stop, write. And so we have them do the first reading. This is we teach them a strategy for breaking apart new words when they come across them in the text, and we stop and we model doing that with them with several keywords in each text. Again, this is just one strategy. You don't have to use our strategy, but they need a strategy, right? So we've built the strategy in. And then we also make sure to think about and then we also use context clues to figure out the meaning of the word, if that's a new word. Then we do a second reading where they think about main ideas and details. So they fill out a little graphic organizer here and write a just statement. And then they fill out a graphic organizer and identify the text structure, and then use the planning sheet to decide what they're going to write. And then use their text structure again, including signal words, to organize an informational text paragraph that they write. So basically, this is just one approach that is trying to pull all of the recommended strategies together and build them around an informational text reading once per week. And so far, we've tested this over 3 years in a number of different, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in 8 schools in both Michigan and New York. And we're finding that we are able to do this work simultaneously. The comprehension and the word reading work can be combined around this informational text reading. We're seeing growth across the board in all measures, except reading motivation, which is not going down. If reading motivation is not going down in 4th and 5th grade, that's considered a win. But we're seeing growth across the other measures, and significant impacts in our qualitative experimental studies on silent reading comprehension and morphological knowledge. We're still finishing up data collection. Actually, we're just starting. My partners in Buffalo are starting data collection for our year 3 study right now. So stay tuned for more information. But the takeaway is not that you need to use our particular program, although you're welcome to. I'll show you where to get more information about that later. But the takeaway is that it is possible to do these things simultaneously. You do not need to have a multisyllabic decoding intervention and a comprehension intervention and a fluency intervention. It's possible to do these things simultaneously while engaging in high quality work around one text. So I don't want teachers to feel overwhelmed. I want to feel like they can really do what they love to do, which is teach around a text and have a high quality engagement with that text, while also addressing all the things that their students need. And again, I showed you the populations that we're working with in this study at the very beginning. These are schools where most of the kids, about half the kids, are below the decoding threshold, and they're still able to participate and benefit in this high-level work. And so I think that's really inspiring, and hopefully wherever you're working, teachers feel like their kids can do this work. So I handed out, there's a handout that went around. I don't know if there are enough copies for everyone, but basically it's a planning sheet to think about taking this work that we've been doing together back to your districts, and think about these 4 areas from the practice guide: multisyllabic decoding, fluency building, comprehension building, and stretch texts. And you can, there's some note taking. We're using the know, do, and be framework. So think about the teacher knowledge and teacher beliefs and confidence that you have in each of these areas. Like, do your teachers know what they need to know about multisyllabic decoding? I understand some of you have districts that with teachers that have just completed letters and they know a lot about this, and that's great. But some of you, they may have teachers who don't feel as confident or don't believe that this is appropriate for their students. So that may be where the work needs to happen. But even if they do have the knowledge, do they have everything they need to do it, right? In all of these areas? Do they have the instructional resources that they need? Do they have the instructional time that they need? Do they have the instructional strategies that they know will work in each of these areas? So that's something to think about too. And then if you flip on the back, you'll see that I'm encouraging you to pick one instructional priority for your work with 4 or 5 teachers in the next year or so. You can't do everything at once, but with one instructional priority, what strategies would you want to incorporate? What do you think there's room for? What do you think would work with what your teachers already know and do and have available to them? And then what kinds of obstacles might you encounter? What thinking traps might hinder the use of these strategies? What professional learning could address these obstacles? And what resources do teachers need to be successful? I wanted to address some questions that came up from the group. I want to make it clear that, like, I'm not trying to advertise my particular program or anything. It's just one example of how you can like try to pull all these different instructional recommendations together. Most of the questions were about Read, Stop, Write, and so I'm happy to talk about that more in the future. I'm happy to come back and do a breakout about Read, Stop, Write if that's helpful. But I do to just address the some of the main questions that came up. We have a website, readstopwrite.com, which will have all of the instructional resources. Again, this is not for sale. This is all going to be free. We're going to put all the lesson plans on the website this summer. If you need them before that, email me and I will get them to you. But we are finalizing all the revisions to the lesson plans based on this year, and we'll have those uploaded this summer. We'll also have YouTube videos showing each of the different days. And so some people were asking me about how this fits into your DRI block if you're using Sharon's program, and actually that it was originally designed to address the needs of students in those FAC and VAC blocks, because those lessons aren't as built out as the lessons for the lower stair steps. So the idea is that you could combine your FAC and VAC groups and have one longer 30-minute lesson for both of those groups, as opposed to trying to plan a FAC lesson and a VAC lesson. And so this, addresses fluency needs and comprehension needs, so you can put them together. And we have tested it in fairly large groups, and that has seemed to work well. We also have middle school lessons. I don't know if any of you need those. Those will be on the website this year. Also, we've built out lessons for grades 6 through 8 as well. And so all of that will be available. Here's some more information about Read, Stop, Write. We have an article in JAL where we describe all the instructional procedures. So that's that QR code on the left. And then we're going to be on the JAL podcast pretty soon talking about it. So keep an eye out for that. I didn't even know JAL had a podcast until they asked us to be on it. So I'm happy to talk more about this in the future. But for the most part, and I'm happy to collaborate. If you want to do research around seeing if this is working in your district, just let me know. But the materials will always be freely available. So anyway, to wrap up, I hope that these sessions have given you a little bit more confidence going back into working with your 4 and 5s and those classrooms, and feel like you have things to offer them and can support them. Another question was about 3rd grade, right? Because 3rd grade is sort of like the gateway to 4th or 5th grade. And what I would say is, 3rd graders are all over the map, right? If there are kids, like if we're thinking about it from a DRI perspective, you want to look at kids who would be in those FAC and VAC groups, and 3rd through 5th grade can also benefit from all of these strategies, right? They're going to be ready for the same things that benefit 4th graders and up. Kids who would fall into those lower stair steps still need that support, and you want to make sure you don't rush them through that. But yeah, I have had with Read, Stop, Write, for example, my son's teacher in 3rd grade used it sort of like off-label in 3rd grade for her FAC and VAC groups because those kids were ready. And so these strategies are absolutely useful for kids who are ready to make that jump in 3rd grade as well. And the way that you would tell, if kids are ready, I think, and if they are making progress, is by looking really close, progress monitoring their oral reading fluency. If they are below benchmark in oral reading fluency, that means that they're going to need more support. And if you're seeing progress on oral reading fluency, that means that they're benefiting from the lessons. So that would be like sort of the quick and easy way to assess and keep track of those kids. So I hope that this was helpful. I really loved learning with you and hearing all of your questions. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll be around for the afternoon breakout sessions as well. So thanks so much.